We good?
We're good.
All right. We will call this meeting of the Finance and Operations Subcommittee of November 30th to order. It looks like it is 5:01. And Dr. Hackett, you are putting up the agenda. Thank you.
And checking.
So we're going to, can everyone see that? I can see it. Thank you. So we're going to continue our planning for January 2021 return to full in-person learning. So I believe you have a presentation, Dr. Hackett, that you want to?
I do. Do you want to start there, Mr. Kokoris? We have an additional item from the town. Do you want to start with that?
Yeah, why don't we, as long as the subcommittee is okay, why don't we go out of order and take that additional item?
So we have the town is part of the, am I still sharing?
No, we see you.
Green Schools, Green Community Program. And there is a requirement that's coming due soon. And they're asking, we're a part of it already, especially through the ESCO program. Just making sure you can see this. Can everyone see this presentation?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. All right. So what needs to happen, what we'd like to have happen on behalf of the town is have you hear this tonight, have Finance and Operations Subcommittee go into school committee as part of their report and just touch on the highlights of it and then bring it back to both you and to the full committee next Monday for a vote. The vote is primarily, I believe, for a vehicle policy, a green energy vehicle policy that really doesn't impact us because of the way it's set up. So Andrew, I'm going to let him talk a little bit about it. He had some limited involvement with it early on. So Andrew, you mind taking this?
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Hackett. Yeah, so this is a designation that the town is applying towards. It's part of the green community. It's called the green community process here. And so there's about 271 municipalities in the state that have already gone through this process. And so if you scroll through to the next slide, you'll see communities that have been part of this designation, and then ones that have kind of been on deck here. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll see, so basically there's a process in certain materials that we have to present, which you'll see in a later slide. If we meet all that criteria, then the town will be eligible to apply for grants related to green communities here. So our estimate that the town received based on some of the initial work is that we could receive about $200,000 a year to make improvements in the community, around green centered projects. So if you go to the next slide, it shows you some other local municipalities and how much that they've received for prior year grants. It is a competitive process each year. But that estimate is around $200,000 a year that they're looking to earn. And the next slide, slide 5, just kind of shows the list of basically the whole list that the town's been going through. So number 1 and 2 have been completed. Number 3 is currently in progress, and I think that'll be finished this week, which is the energy reduction plan for the town. And number 4 is kind of what the focus from the town, what the town needs from the schools end here is this policy about fuel efficient vehicles. And right now we only have one vehicle that would meet the need to be fuel efficient. We currently have an electric vehicle that meets that. All of our other vehicles are labeled as heavy duty and they're exempt right now. And then number 5 was adopted by the town, I think, in the last winter or spring. So it's kind of the last piece here. And then they'll be looking to apply, I think, by the end of this month. If there's any further questions, we can have Lorraine C., who's the contract administrator, grant writer for the town, and she'll be available next week. She can speak more towards the energy reduction plan and any other questions here on it.
Okay. Do we have any questions from the subcommittee?
Yes, one, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Mr. Devon?
Thank you. Through the chair. What effect does our ESCO project that we started, a few years ago, and we'd like to think that we're progressing with that. How much does that project help the town totally? And what percentage would they use of that?
I'm not sure in terms of the percentage. I think that'd be a good question for Lorraine maybe to speak to next week. I know that whole process, the schools were kind of ahead of it. And that certainly helped the effort here in terms of charting that and that work already done. So I know that that work was considered as part of this grant. I think we get a better rate because of that. So no, it was included.
Okay, last follow-up. We know that we have an ESCO project. We know that we have the new East Middle School. That has a certain, shall we say, value to it, be it silver or gold as far as the energy efficiency, the LEED program, and as well as our online South project. I would like to think these would have a positive effect going forward towards us securing this money, because any money we can get just helps us all, be it the schools or the town. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Devon. Any other questions?
Yeah, through the chair.
Go ahead, Ms. Saros.
Just quick, how many vehicles does the school have? And then like the planning of the new South, is that like, can we do more green? Are we working with Mike in designing to be more green?
So I'll answer the second question first, and Ed can answer the first one. We are, MSBA gives points, credit points for designs that meet green energy efficiency criteria, primarily through the LEED program. It actually reduces or gives us more money through the MSBA if we meet certain aspects of the LEED program. I believe that South also, like East, would be LEED Silver. In fact, I believe we got South in just in time before the criteria for LEED changed. They're really now going to this whole zero net energy criteria that it's much more difficult to meet, as I understand it. So South is already being designed to be as green as possible in trying to meet the criteria of LEED Silver.
And we have 5 pickup trucks currently and 1 Ford Transit van that we use to move stuff around Courier.
And then we still have the 2 electric
Okay.
vehicles.
Any other questions?
We have 1 electric vehicle, I'm
Right.
sorry. We had leased 2. The leases ran out. We purchased 1 of them because that was all we really needed.
Okay. Any other
Thank you.
questions? All right. I just have one question. So what is the action? I understand, I believe what the program is. What is the action that's going to be required by us or the committee? What are we asking for?
So as I understand it, specifically is the adoption of the vehicle policy that Andrew, I don't know if you could speak to it a little bit more specifically, but we'll have Lorraine come on next meeting and we'll have that in front of you.
Yep. Yeah. So it'd be the 2 parts. One is so the town has put forth that energy reduction plan. And so we want the schools just to kind of acknowledge that and say that they're kind of they're for it. And then the next part would be the fuel efficient vehicle purchase policy that says if we look to replace that electric vehicle in the future, we'd want to buy a similar electric vehicle that meets that standard.
Okay. And then the building, because there was a lot of discussion about the building. On the building side, it sounds like we're already in compliance with this. Is that correct?
We've certainly, it was helped. The ESCO project was very helpful and allowed the town to leverage the work that had been done through ESCO. And to Mr. Devon's point, obviously through East, and now with the South coming online, we'll continue to be able to put the town overall in a better position for additional grant funding down the line. Obviously, we have the most square
Thank
footage.
you. So you're looking for us to vote this evening to bring it to the committee?
No, I'm
Or
not
what
looking
would
for a
you
vote.
like
It
us
wasn't
to
on the
do?
agenda, but we wanted to give you a preview. This came to us kind of, this is the way these kind of grants go sometimes. It came to us a little bit last minute, so we wanted to get in front of you tonight, just to have you be aware of it, and then we'll bring it to you as a subcommittee and to the school committee. If I can get the school committee chair to agree to meeting again next week, which I think we kind of have to do for a couple things, but at some point next week, bring it to the school committee.
Mr. Chair, if I may,
Mr. Devon?
thank you, through the chair. Okay, so we know that we've got a quote unquote kind of like, shall we say, not put the pedal to the gas on this, but we know that it is time sensitive and there's money at the very end of it. And it's just basically, shall we say, piggybacking on, shall we say, past ideas, or as far as us moving towards a more greener community. And hence the fact that we entered into the ESCO projects, as well as, the lead silver on East, and we'll be continuing that type of a thought process on the South project. I see no problem with us bringing this tonight to the school committee for a first reading.
Okay.
Is that what you're asking?
That's what I'm thinking, so that we can take action next week.
I see no problem with it. It's just informational as of tonight. It's considered a first reading for us. Obviously, we could, shall we say, augment a bit next week and then bring it to the greater committee for a second reading. I don't have a problem with that. Does anyone procedurally?
No, I would say I would entertain a motion to bring it to the committee for a first reading. Do I have that motion?
I'll make that
Okay.
motion, Mr. Chair.
Do I have a
Second.
second? Okay, we have a motion and a second. Ms. Saros?
Aye.
Mr. Devon?
Aye.
And the chair votes aye, so that's unanimous. So Dr. Hackett will bring that to the committee tonight, informationally as a first reading.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
And Andrew, if they have a million questions, it's all on you. Just kidding. Okay, Dr. Hackett, and then we can move forward with the main agenda item if you're ready.
Yeah, I'll call it up right now.
All right, sounds good.
See it.
There it is.
Okay, well, here we are again. Seemed like a short week, and actually it was a short week from the last time we met, but we've been able to obviously continue the work of how kind of the plan for a in-person learning expansion. Tonight, what we want to talk about, the first few slides are from the last meeting we had. I think it's kind of important, given the pace of this, that we just keep the slide deck together so that we can kind of build the story as we go. I'm not going to spend time really going over a ton of these slides. I know Mr. Kokoris is going to review the first few with the school committee tonight, coming out of the Finance and Operations Subcommittee report to the school committee. But just a reminder, we're looking to expand full in-person learning pre-K through 12 for January 21, while also maintaining our remote learning option. Expansion to full in-person learning. So the goal is to bring all kids back for in-person learning. Yet at the same time, we would be maintaining our fully remote option for students. You identified 4 key planning areas: facilities, staffing, transportation, health, and safety. We talked a little bit about facilities at the last meeting, some about facilities tonight. We're going to talk about staffing as it relates to scheduling and also ties back into facilities. The main drivers for the full in-person return, the things that are, kind of the challenges that we've got to figure out is number one, and most importantly, the physical distancing decision to reduce from the 6 foot to 3 feet, which is the minimum that the state would require, or that they're guiding on, I should say. We have, as you know, been at the 6 feet physical distancing in classroom building and also on our buses. It would involve the elimination of cohorts. We'd be collapsing the cohorts to bring all both A and B cohorts together at the same time. Again, staffing assignments and accommodations is a main driver for us, trying to figure out how do we staff it, which we get into some of that discussion tonight and some of the planning work that's been happening. Transportation, we know that if we're going to transport more kids, we've got to reduce the physical distancing to get more kids on the bus. this decision or the transportation question is kind of independent of the decision for a full in-person return. But obviously we realize that we have students who would benefit from being able for us to be able to get more students on the bus. We're right now at the 2+ mile limit or minimum standard is provided by the state. And then we have several operational considerations, remote learning students. How do we manage that program for students when we're bringing staff back more in person? Across the board, our staff provides the full remote learning program for our students. Custodial services, we just need to make sure that if we're going to increase the number of students in our buildings and increase the amount of time our students are in the buildings, that we're paying attention to, as I think we've done a very good job with, making sure that we're hitting high touch surfaces and providing a clean and safe and disinfected environment for students and staff. Implementation timing with school schedules. We talked a little bit about this. We won't talk too much about it tonight again, but this has mainly to do with the fact that we are coming up on the end of the semesters in January for both the high school and the middle school, which does have implications for grade reporting, midterms, for example, at the high school level, and also for classes that are scheduled on a semester basis versus those that are scheduled full year. Food service and how we provide lunch and how we make sure that we're doing that safely is another component of that, of the operational considerations. And then student movement within and outside of the building. We're going to have more kids on campus and in our buildings all at the same time. That's going to have some implications for how our students move within hallways. We've already struggled some with gathering outside of school, both before and after school. We've had some issues with students getting to school too early and they're outside and relatively unsupervised, whether they walk or got them there themselves or parents drop them off on the way to work, which is a perennial issue, that we generally aren't too concerned about, but it becomes more of a problem if we've got issues around distancing. So discussed at the last meeting, won't spend a lot of time on this. This was the classroom building capacity chart. Number of classrooms in each of our buildings, excluding East and the high school. We will not be talking about the high school tonight because that is a little bit of a different animal. We will be bringing that to you at the next meeting. And then we talked about there's a calculator that you can use to estimate the number of students that you can get into classrooms based on the dimensions of the classroom. And you can change the criteria for whether you want 3 feet, for example, or 6 feet physical distancing. So the distancing in a general classroom, and again, there's a lot of variables with this, but the general classrooms at 650, 750, 850, and 1200, you can see the number of students that potentially could get into those classrooms and still be 3 foot physically distanced. So one of the things, I've talked a little bit about this already, the building capacities, but the other issue we have is our core spaces, and we'll talk about that a little bit more tonight, but core spaces being including the gymnasium, cafeterias, media centers. How do we manage those from a few different perspectives? Small group instructional and support spaces has been a challenge for us in terms of our HVAC and ventilation testing. First of all, at 6 foot physical distancing, they've been pretty difficult to use. But when we've got a small group or even one student who's receiving some kind of either counseling session from a guidance counselor or a school psychologist or testing, the spaces that we have, some of the spaces we have for that purpose either don't have a window or don't have any ventilation at all. So spaces that have no mechanical ventilation system or a window, we have not been using. We've been taking those offline. Unfortunately, that impacts some of these spaces, well, more than it would our general classrooms for a lot of reasons. But it's already a concern. It's been a challenge. And if we're bringing students in full time together, then we're going to have more students who are going to need those services at the same time. So we have to focus on that and try to resolve some of those issues. Class sizes impact on scheduling. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then the cafeteria and how we serve lunch, because in the cafeteria, we need to plan in my view, and I think supported by others, if we're going to be feeding students and they're going to be taking their mask off, then we need to maintain a 6-foot physical distancing. I mean, it's also within the guidance and from the state that 6 feet is preferably the distancing. 3 feet's allowable for whatever reason in schools. And if 6 feet, if you're gonna have your mask off, we would wanna make sure that we're maintaining a 6-foot distance. So tonight we're gonna talk about staffing and scheduling and staffing for grades 1 through 8. So with the return to in full person learning, obviously we're gonna be combining the cohorts. A and B will be coming every day of the week. We'll no longer be separating them out Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. That can only happen if we go to 3 feet physical distancing, obviously. And in some cases, which we're going to show you tonight, we have some challenges in terms of even at a 3-foot physical distancing. And it's really related to number 2, building and classroom capacities. And then we'll talk about some logistical challenges, and then we'll kind of talk about, as we've thought about them, pros and cons of moving to a full in-person all-day learning. And that list is obviously not exhaustive. So combining the cohorts, we're bringing them together every day for a full day. The assumption right now that we have to work with, I believe, because there's just really no other way to control for it, is that our hybrid and full remote numbers are going to stay the same. So we have to find a way, and I talked a little bit about this last time, if we're going to do this, because of how tight it is with staffing and with space, particularly in certain buildings, we have to start with the assumption that our numbers are not going to shift on us, because a shifting of numbers of movement particularly from full remote back into hybrid could have very serious consequences for us in terms of our overall planning. So we have to have some kind of sense that those numbers remain stable for a period of time, and then we figure out some kind of controlled reentry of students moving from full remote into hybrid if they want to come back to in-person learning. And the creation of new schedules through Aspen at each elementary school. Jim can talk a little bit about that in terms of our specialist planning and scheduling. So this is just a quick dashboard look at our schools, again, with the exception of East and with the exception of the high school. Obviously, some of these numbers are pulled from an earlier slide, but the room status is new information or information we wanted to provide for you tonight. This is essentially the work that we've done on HVAC improvements and repairs, and then our ventilation testing that we've conducted in all of our buildings, in fact, in all of our rooms and classrooms. So you will see, just I'm not going to read down through it, but for the most part, in all of our buildings, all of our general ed classrooms, the classrooms that our general education students are in, are online. We have a couple at Hollis that are full-size rooms. They are used for special services, but they could carry a full classroom in their regular-sized rooms that are still offline. That's related mainly to, obviously, to HVAC. And some of our buildings, we have just straight heat source, and we don't have ventilation system in some classrooms, in the older classrooms in particular. So, I feel very good about where we are from a classroom standpoint. I believe that if we made that decision to return, just in terms of the number of classrooms that we have online, we are in a good position to do that. The small group instructional spaces will remain an issue and a challenge for us, and it'll be exacerbated by the fact that we're going to be bringing more kids back in. But at least we're in a position where we know that we're going to be able to utilize our general education classrooms. I also gave you just an idea, kind of the range of the square footage of in each one of the buildings. And you can see there's, there really is a variety, but generally we're kind of around 700-ish on average, 800-ish on average across the board. That relates back obviously to the calculation of 3 feet and how many students you can get into those classrooms. So I'm going to run you through a couple of these, not every single one, but what we've done is we've taken every school and we've taken the grades that school services. We've combined the cohort. So this is A and B together, who are currently in hybrid at each grade level at each school. We've got a column here for the number of remote students we have. And then we've just totaled that so that we can have a sense for kind of, and I don't mean to say it this way or don't mean it with this intention, but kind of the worst case scenario. So what would happen if all 52 kids showed up in grade 1 at Flaherty? And then how many sections do we currently have and what would happen if all 52 of these students showed up based on the 3-foot physical distancing and how much spacing we would need. So this note section is in response to if all these kids and all these students come back, then, and this is the number of sections we currently have in school in person, not remote, but in school in person, then if they all came back at each grade level, what would we need to do from a staffing and spacing standpoint? Now, when I say additional section needed, that's not saying that we need to hire staff. What that's saying is we're going to have an impact potentially on these students. Well, obviously we would on teachers who are teaching full remote. So if all 52 of these kids come back in grade 1 from Flaherty and 16 remote come back, then we've got some staffing implications in our fully remote program that we would have to look at in order to add an additional section at grade 1, for example. Jim, could you talk just a little bit about how we are providing our full remote program at the elementary level, just so we can understand the context of this?
Certainly. So at the elementary level, almost exclusively by site, there are full remote sections for each grade. There are a couple of sites where we actually combined kids from Ross and kids from Flaherty, just because the numbers were small, and by combining them, it was a more efficient use of personnel. But overall, at each elementary school, there's a full remote section for grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, grade 4. And at grade 5, it really becomes part of East in terms of full remote. So as you look at the numbers of remote students, you can think in terms of a teacher being attached to each one of those groups. As Dr. Hackett indicated, if those remote students were to begin coming back into the hybrid model, there's a tipping point where we would need additional sections, and then we'd have to make some decisions about how we structure the full remote program. Muted.
Maybe you said this, I'm sorry if I didn't hear it, but because I was muted, I couldn't hear everything. We also have students from schools who are being taught in full remote by teachers from other buildings, correct? Because we have
I covered that. We have probably less than a handful of sections, grade level sections, where 2 or 3 schools are combined just to make the numbers work for a decent sized section.
Okay, thank you. So then just looking at the core spaces at Flaherty, for example, and again, we did 6-foot physical distancing for both the gymnasium and cafeteria spaces. If we were going to do something with physical education, then just to make the assumption that we would want to maintain 6 feet of physical distancing, this gives us a sense using that calculator again, based on the square footage of the space, of how many students we would be able to have in that space at the same time. One of the challenges, it's a challenge when we're in, before pre-pandemic challenge, was at the cafeteria gymnasium at Flaherty is the same space. So we know that that space can't be scheduled for food service and gym PE at the same time. That becomes an issue because when we are trying to schedule a full day, when students are in physical education class, for example, they're coming out of a couple of classrooms, which helps us or allows us the ability to schedule both teacher lunches and planning times that are within the contract. So if we can't figure that out, depending on the capacities, it is going to be a challenge that we have to kind of think through some of the other spaces. It's not insurmountable, but it is something that we need to pay attention to. And then the media center, I included this on each one of these slides. It's being used in different ways at different schools. Right now, Flaherty has used that space as swing space. If we had to add an extra class because we had a higher enrollment at a grade level, which happened to us a few years ago, then we do it in there. One of the challenges of the media center at Flaherty is actually on one side of the room is actually a hallway into some back classrooms that are used for our district-wide programming. So does anyone have any questions just on the general structure of the information that's on here?
I have one question, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Devon?
Thank you, through the chair. Frank, this type of information will be put up on our website so people can know the actual numbers and how how this methodology is coming forward.
It's every single meeting you have as a subcommittee and as a school committee, all the presentations are posted, as well as the video from the meeting. So there's a lot of information that goes back to the summer on what we've done.
Excellent. So what we're saying is anyone that would ask us questions to these situations, it's for them to do a little bit of digging, and they would be able to come up with this information.
Exactly.
Thank you. That's helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Devon. Any other questions? I have one quick question. This is a great slide. I think this gives us great perspective. You mentioned the scheduling, the fact that we have so many students remote now and so many students in the hybrid model. Would we, as we think about this, is one of the considerations that on January 4th, for example, that's the way that stays so we can implement, and then we have a phased in if you want to move from full remote, or vice versa?
That would absolutely be our preference, is to start whenever the implementation of this would happen, to start status quo with the students who are on full remote and the students in our hybrid, so we can get our feet underneath us. We can know what our experience is, and then we can do some kind of a controlled reentry plan. The challenge is going to come with, just as an example, if 5 of these kids who are in 4th grade who are full remote, 5 of the 19 decide they want to come back, that's one thing. And if it's kind of evenly distributed, it will be easier to manage. If all 19 and every other 4th grader who's in full remote right now across the school system decides they want to come back in person, that's going to be a problem. So we just really need to make sure that we provide ourselves the time and space to figure out how to bring students back in. We obviously want them back in school, but to Mr. Lee's point, there is a tipping point. And when we hit those tipping point markers, we just have to know, what our next step will be with that.
Yeah, I'm just trying to be conscious of the fact that we have a couple of weeks left before we need to present this to the full committee, and then a couple of weeks after that to implement. So I think we have to think hard about making a major shift or a major opportunity to shift for the first section of this plan.
We do. And I think, from order of priority, I think the first decision that has to be made, which is a policy decision really, is the reduction from 6 feet physical distancing to 3. Until you make that decision as a school committee, then we're not going to be able to do what we're talking about and bring more people, more students in person at the same time. The second decision I think that has to be made is the one that you just talked about, Mr. Course, and that is, we have to figure out, from a hybrid and fully remote student perspective, some kind of phased in approach that allows us to control the numbers so that we're not in a position where we have more kids that we can manage within an individual classroom or within an individual school. I mean, the margins are really, really tight for us. So we've got to make sure that we know what we're walking into for the first couple of weeks, and then again, figure out how to phase in returns if parents and students want their students to return.
So just to go back to your first question, the policy question, is that something we might want to go back to the school committee with earlier than the full plan? So again, we can't move forward if we don't get that agreement by the full committee. So yes, maybe what we need to do, this evening is talk about that when we wrap up. And if we want to take a vote to bring it at least as a first reading to the full committee.
That decision, everything else hinges on that decision.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Mr. Devon?
Thank you, through the chair. Yes, that decision is paramount. As we bring this type of information to the greater committee, I think it's important to let people know that, look, not only are we looking towards this plan as of the first of the year, if it's attainable and or doable, but we're also augmenting the planning that we're doing on a daily basis now with what's coming our way with staffing situations. And we also have a plan if things were to, quote unquote, and maybe it's not the right way to say it, but if we were to incur more sickness as far as the COVID, that we would go full remote. I think people should realize that it's not just this that we're dealing with. we deal with the, the changing of the plans daily with, what happens with the staffing wise, and with our eye looking if things go wrong with this, that we could go full remote and what that timetable would look like. I mean, am I being wrong, Mr. Chair?
No, thank you, Mr. Devon. I think I want to keep us focused on the fact that all those other things are kind of things we've been dealing with since March. So in this case, I want to keep us pretty focused on if all those things fall into place, our plan is to get back on January 4th.
Mr.
Because
Chair,
I think there are a lot of other things that are kind of outside of what we're talking about right now that we've been dealing with, as you said, on a daily basis. But I want us to stay kind of laser focused on if we can figure those things out, what does this look like?
I think the statement you just made kind of sums it up. I mean, if you want to, the way you just explained it to me, we know that there are certain people that don't understand that, last March, our educational system, blew up, and we've been trying to recreate it many different ways. And there are some people wondering, hey, do they even know that if they had to go to full remote, do they have that capacity? We've been thinking about that since, all the time. I think there's a section of the populace that wonders if we have that type of a plan, if we had to go full remote. Yes, it's within our power to do that. We've had that plan. But I think you said, if all things fall into place, this is what you're looking at the first of the year. I think that quantifies it. Is that the right way to put it?
Oh, I agree. I agree.
I just want people to realize it's not just us, flipping coins and whistling past the graveyard on this.
I would just also add that regardless of whether whenever this happens, this planning has to happen in order for us to be able to do it. I don't want to point out the obvious, but we have to have a plan to return to more in-person learning. We know 3 feet is a minimum we need to hit, period. So we have to hit that parameter, right? So until that changes, then 3 feet is the minimum distancing we need to hit. And we do need to know, obviously, how do we get back to more full in-person learning, even everyone in person at 3 feet? And what are those challenges? So whether things go perfectly and we're able to implement this at the 1st of January, or whether things change, as Mr. Devon's point, and it has to be delayed for whatever reason, this planning still has to happen, and we'll have it and we'll be ready to go with it. And so, regardless of what you tell us in terms of the 3 feet physical distancing, there really is no reason for us to put the brakes on any of this planning work if in fact people were not comfortable with the 3 feet right now. I mean, that doesn't have to be decided for the planning to continue. It has to be decided for the plan to be implemented.
That makes sense. That makes sense, Dr. Hackett.
Thank you.
Thank you. So again, I'm not going to take you through every one of these, but we've built these out for each one of our elementary schools, with the exception of Inadequate. You know your buildings well. You can see where we're going to have a little bit more of a problem, where we're going to be all right. We know that things will be more tighter at potentially at Liberty School because of the numbers, as well as at Highlands. And again, particularly in the buildings that we have our district-wide programming in, the small group instructional space issue is still a challenge, and I don't have great answers to how to figure that out, to be honest with you right now, but we continue to work on it. So you can see, again, we built it out for all the schools. And now I'll let Mr. Lee kind of talk about East and South.
Yeah, but before we do that, can we jump back a couple of slides and go to Liberty for a second? One of the challenges that we'll discuss when we talk about East and South is lunch. And it's also an issue at the elementary schools. And as part of the slide that Dr. Hackett put together, obviously this is Liberty. The cafeteria at 6 feet has a capacity of 30 kids. And so using just the numbers that we know, that would mean that we'd have to run 10 to 11 lunch periods to get everybody through lunch, which from a practical standpoint, you can't do it that way with young kids who need food. So we're assessing other options that we could come up with in order to be able to feed kids. But this is one of those building constraints that is going to come up over and over again as we plan. That is an issue that needs to be resolved as we talk about being able to feed kids throughout the district while they're in school for a full day. Jump back to East, Dr. Hackett.
And just to add to that, and related to that, obviously, if you're serving 10 to 11 lunch periods, you're not going to be able to do it. You likely would have to look at a space like the gymnasium. But if you're going to use the gymnasium for food service, then that's going to become a factor with offering physical education, which is a way in which we provide teachers with not only students with the curriculum of physical education, but also it provides teachers with their planning time and with their lunch break too. So it's a compounding problem that we really do need to figure out.
Can I ask a quick question since we're talking about lunch? Have we looked at serving lunch in the classroom rather than bringing them to a big space?
I would, yes. The challenge will be that we can't get to 6 feet, right? If we're going to go 3 feet, if you think about a self-contained grade 3 classroom, for example, and we've built it out so we were at 3 feet physical distancing and we've maxed that classroom out. We can't turn around and make that 6 feet for when kids are going to eat their lunch. It's obviously not quite that simple, but it does limit our ability to provide food in the classroom if we're at 3 feet physical distancing. The data I think is clear as any other data that the virus is transmitted airborne, right? We know it's aerosolized, and we know that, or we don't know, but for sure, but there's some data and some decent research around the fact that it can hang in the air for a period of time. Hence the importance of wearing a mask all the time. I get nervous, honestly, about having students remove their masks, period. I especially get nervous about them removing it at less than 6 feet. And I especially get nervous about them removing it in a space where they're going to be for most of the day and the instructional classroom space. So my hope would be that we would be able to figure out lunches in larger spaces and not within classrooms. I didn't get my medical degree recently, so I'm not proclaiming to be an expert. And I certainly there's a lot of stuff we just don't know about this virus, but we do know that we've had people tell us, a parent in particular, who works at Boston Children's, that, that period of time when students don't have the mask on, it's another potential exposure risk, or it's heightened exposure risk. And certainly being at 3 feet, would presumably increase that. And I think if we can get ourselves into the cafeterias or larger spaces for lunch, I just think that really is a good protective factor for us to consider.
Can I ask a question or make a statement?
Sure.
I'm just, as a nurse, I just keep going back to, okay, even if you go back to that Highlands or Liberty, you have 6 feet, 10 to 11 lunches. Divide that by 2 if you go down to 3 feet. That's still 5 lunches. And I just think the risk, look at the restaurants that are now closing. I just think we try to avoid it like the plague, like try to avoid doing lunch. I don't know, do a long extended day, something, but the kids taking off the mask is just gonna make our numbers skyrocket.
Thank you, Ms. Saros.
We will continue the exercise of trying to figure that out and see if we can figure out, can we schedule lunch in larger spaces at 6 feet and still make the schedule work from specials and planning time and all the rest of the components of the schedule. So, we've got a good jump on it now. You can see kind of where some of the data are leading us in terms of the challenges anyway. And, hopefully we'll be able to come back to you and say, this is how we would do it. We might also come back to you and say, we just can't, there really are no good options. As we work on this over the next week or so, we'll have a little bit more, some more instances around that, hopefully. But Mr. Lee?
So in terms of the middle schools, it is a slightly different story between East and South, just given the newness of the East building and the size of the classrooms there. At 3 feet social distancing at East, the assumption would be that we could get about 22 students in a room. And you'll see that in comparison to South in a second. So, using the number of classrooms that are available at East, that would give us a capacity in the building of 1,298. And currently the enrollment at East is 1,047. So that's a math problem that works in our favor. At lunch at East, which as you recall has 2 cafeterias, it's 6 feet distancing. You can get about 78 kids in each one of the cafes, or 156 students total for one lunch sitting. Currently at East, they have 724 hybrid students. Again, this assumes that no remote kids are moving, so 724 existing hybrid students. So that in and of itself would necessitate 5 lunches being run at East. One of the issues in the middle schools, as we go through this exercise, is the conversation around the specials. And specials are classes like PE, art, music. So typically those classes, from a scheduling perspective, run in terms of numbers between high 20s, pushing 30. And that's for a number of different reasons. It's a way, as Dr. Hackett indicated, that we get teacher preps in those windows. We have a lot of kids who want to take these classes. They're typically not full year courses. But if we have to stay at 22, then we can't get the number of students into the classes as they're currently constituted. And that's a scheduling problem for us. So that's a logistical scheduling issue that we need to try to resolve. We would not have enough staffing to create sections of 22 at 3 feet and serve all the kids who are currently being served by our specialist program. So that's an issue that we've been working on. In that equation, one of the things that would become in jeopardy is specials for those kids who are in the full remote program. If we need more staff to provide in-person specials to students at East, that would mean we, in theory, have less staff to devote to the full remote kids who are not coming into East. And so the question would become, what, if any, specials would be available to full remote students in that particular program? In contrast, South is a bit more of a challenging situation because their classrooms, as the building is older, tend to be smaller. So at 3 feet social distancing, they can only get about 18 kids in a room. That makes, if you add up all their classrooms, a building capacity of 545 students, and their current enrollment is 661. And so that's a math problem that does not work for us. It's the opposite of East. Lunches at South are a very big issue that we need to resolve because of the size of the cafeteria. They can seat approximately 40 students for lunch at 6 feet. Currently, the number of hybrid students at South is 483, which would necessitate 12 lunches. Again, assuming nobody returns from full remote to feed the kids who are coming in person to South. So as Dr. Hackett explained, this is the challenge we're trying to solve, trying to be creative in terms of the resources that we do have, but this is a major issue as it relates to South. The same problem as East in terms of specials. Their average class sizes currently are mid-20s and above. Again, if we have to go down to 17 to 18 to stay at 3 feet, we're not going to be able to schedule all the kids into the specials. And so this is a staffing issue. This is a scheduling issue, and one that we have not found a solution for just yet. Similar to East, if we needed to bring staff back into the building to serve hybrid students who are in person all day, that could mean that full remote students would have limited, if not no, specials in a program that would be created from there. I believe that all of you have been into South. The other issue over at South is the physical layout of the building. In essence, it's got one major hallway and it's got one set of stairs that leads to the downstairs classroom. So in terms of keeping kids apart as they transition from classroom to classroom, the challenges at South are far greater than those at East. And this is the work that we're currently doing as it relates to trying to make sure that we have a safe environment for students at both South and at East.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Any questions from the subcommittee? Okay, I just want to make a couple of comments before we move into the pros and cons, if that's okay. Two things. I think, again, I'd just like to get the understanding of the subcommittee if we want to bring forward the 3-foot question to the full committee this evening, because I think it does have an impact on the date that we're talking about for implementation of a plan. And then I think the second part, and, again, I'd like to understand how the subcommittee feels about it, but it just seems to me, looking at these slides, and this is obviously new information to us this evening, that the whole focus should be on how can we get kids back in long enough to get their academic subjects. And I'd rather have the group, the administration, work more on the academic scheduling than the lunch scheduling. So I don't know if it's the will of the subcommittee, but we could talk about that this evening and give direction to Dr. Hackett and Mr. Lee to maybe kind of take the look away from how to accommodate lunches and focus more on the full schedule of academics. So I'll open it up to the subcommittee.
I completely agree with you, George. I think the focus needs to get as much education as possible with these students, and stressing about lunch and kids taking off masks and how we're going to do 12 lunches in a school day. Let's focus on getting the kids in as much education in a day as possible.
Thank you, Ms. Saros. Mr. Devon?
Well, I'm kind of pensive on this in that it's an operational problem all the way around. And we've always known that there are going to be bottlenecks, be it transportation. And the safety aspect of the bottleneck at lunch is one we can't just reduce just because it's educationally convenient. I mean, I would like to know what the town health officer, Mary Beth McGrath, what her opinion on this would be. Does she have anything that might, shall we say, help us move or mitigate this situation, whereby the opinion of the chair and the other member? Yeah. In other words, I'm saying, get me there. How do you convince me? Get me there.
So I think, I guess what I would say to your question about the health officer is what we're talking about with lunches kind of transcends that, right? We're really talking about a scheduling issue, even at 3 feet, and we wouldn't be comfortable, if we need to have 11 lunches and we move to 3 feet, then we need to have, 5 or 6. So I think that the challenge is more on a scheduling side for safety than, because we only have a finite space to serve kids lunch with a mask off. I'm saying, and I think Ms. Saros is saying the same thing, we want to focus on the academic scheduling and not have the administration so focused on the lunch scheduling.
You know what? I see what you're saying. All right, let's run that forward. Let's see where we go with it. I can go with you there.
Okay, so what I'm asking is, I think those two things, just to give Dr. Hackett and Mr. Lee a little more direction for our next meeting, those are two things in our report this evening we can bring forward to the committee to see what the will of the full committee is.
I'm in agreement. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, do we need to make a motion to do that, Dr. Hackett, or is that just a report?
Well, I think it depends on what in my view, what you're asking. If you're asking the committee to make a decision tonight on one going to 3 feet, and again, that's more about a timing of implementation decision. So that isn't really necessary because we still have to do the planning. But given what you're discussing, and I completely agree, I think the data show it, the challenge of trying to get kids through lunch, given our scheduling and spacing issues, is going to be very difficult to surmount. So that is going to be difficult to surmount as long as we're at 3 feet, which likely would be the remainder of the school year. So it seems to me that if you are thinking that you'd like to get them to take action on saying we want more full in-person time, we are not necessarily saying that we want to be a normal full day, normal as in pre-pandemic full day. That would be, that'd be, I think, great if you felt that way, to take a vote on it tonight to bring it to the school committee for their first discussion around it. Because to your point earlier, Mr. Kokoris, there's not a whole lot of time, given the fact that we have 2 weeks off for the Christmas holiday vacation period at the end of December. And it would allow us certainly to focus on getting scheduling the academic components of the schedule instead of trying to figure out how we do in some ways what may be not even possible to do.
Right. And I believe,
But not possible across the board in every school.
correct. And again, I believe if we're going to continue to shoot for that January 4th date, then I think we have to be realistic about what trade-offs. And I think that's exactly what we started to get together for a couple of weeks ago is, what are the trade-offs? What are the things we can solve? And the things that we can't solve, let's figure out how to move around those things so we can get to a place where we're getting kids more academic time, right? I mean, I know I made the comment last week, I think it was, after Ms. Saros talked about the smiling faces, right? That's kind of what we're doing, right? That's kind of what we would call this, right? Operation Smiling Faces. Because the idea is that, when we get kids back into school on a more regular basis, whatever that looks like, we know the result is that, happier for them and happier for the staff and happier for parents and everybody involved. So I think that's got to be ultimately the goal that we want to shoot for. And if we can get that in front of the committee as a first reading tonight, I would love to do that.
Mr. Chair, I have one question.
Mr. Devon.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, it's not just a first reading. Isn't it more or less informationally let them know exactly what we're looking at, and so that they'll know some of the bottlenecks what we're encountering here, and alerting them rather than having this, come to them. You don't want to say, in a short period of time. It gives them the time to work through some of this and have questions also, right? So this is informational, which I believe is always a positive.
Well, I think we need to get their buy-in for next meeting, if we meet next week, so that this plan can, we can't get a plan in front of them for January 4th if we don't get those two things agreed to. I think you were talking about bottlenecks.
Yes.
And I think we understand that these are two major bottlenecks that we won't be able to put a plan in front of them in a couple of weeks to get kids back to school January 4th without them having agreement on these two things.
Here, I'm in agreement.
Okay, so why don't we, if I would entertain a motion that we bring that forward to the school committee tonight.
Kyle, I'll make the motion.
I'm making the motion. That
And I'll
was
second
Brad.
it.
Okay,
I'll second it.
we have a motion and a second. Ms. Saros,
Aye.
Mr. Devon,
Aye.
and the chair votes aye. Okay, so I think I understand what the motion is. So I think we've got that settled. So Dr. Hackett, you wanted to go through pros and cons. We might have jumped the gun a little bit.
No,
but-
I'm glad. No, that was a very helpful conversation. Certainly worth the time. So again, for lack of better terms, pros and cons, and again, not an exhaustive list, but just some things that we've thought about. Obviously, the pros of getting more in-person instructional time is, to all of your points, more consistent in-person instruction time. We've already seen the benefits of that with the implementation of the elementary 4 half-day decision that we made and we've implemented. I mean, I know and have heard from several parents, including a parent on this subcommittee, who has talked about the fact that of the difference it's made for students. I'm certainly getting the same kind of strong feedback from our staff as well. More students in school on a daily basis and together with the others who are in their cohort. I mean, I do think that's a pro. I mean, these kids have not been together as a full class other than when they're doing it remotely. They get a chance to see more of their friends or more of the students in their class or more of their friends within the school. From a social emotional standpoint, that's obviously a gain. More efficacious model for teachers planning classes for students. Let Jim kind of talk about that in a second and just kind of run down through the easier ones. Reduction in screen time for students. We know that that is definitely a positive. Increase of in-person time for special education, special services and guidance supports are more vulnerable learners to be in person more often. Certainly is a big benefit. It's been one of the challenges delivering. Obviously, some of our special ed services has been challenging to do because of the way that we've had to work through the schedule. Some of the cons, the impact of full remote program and student movement between models. As Mr. Lee said earlier, and as we talked through this, we've got to figure that out regardless of when and how, but we've got to figure out how we can kind of hold on to the current numbers as we implement this, and then figure out a way to bring students who want to come back more in person, a way and a timeline to do that doesn't just throw us into a situation that we can't figure out. The effect of 3 feet combined cohorts on quarantining of staff and students. I mean, the good news is we're quarantining at 6 feet now, entire classrooms, so the practice would stay the same. But we have more bodies in the classrooms, we have more bodies in the hallways, opening and dismissal times. We talked about collecting outside of the building. There'll be more kids on our campuses. So the contact is also there's potential contact and transmission every day. As it happens now, we've had several cases where a student who was in cohort B, tested positive on, Saturday. Well, that's not a good example. They're in cohort A, they test positive later in the week. We don't have to, when we go back to 48 hours, there's no impact on any classmates or any teachers. So therefore, we don't have to quarantine anybody. In this model, the potential is there every single day for that contact to happen. So there will definitely, in my view, be an impact on, the frequency with which we have to quarantine. Actual net in-person instructional time gained in the full person plannings. We've talked about some of this tonight and we talked about it before. It's somewhat limited. Is it worth some of the risks that we've talked about and some of the logistical challenges to gain what essentially would not be really a full another half day? And is there a way to get more full in-person learning without going for the full day? Increased demand for transportation and more complex logistics for scheduling routes. If we can get to the 3 feet on in our buildings, then we can presumably get to the 3 feet on our buses and would allow us to offer more transportation. But we again have to be mindful of making sure that we can meet the state minimum requirements around transportation, which is the 2+ miles through grade 6. But we would look to expand that as quickly as we could. And then less flexibility to cover quarantine staff. So we have availability of people as well as our flex spaces. If we're using our cafeteria and our gymnasium to feed kids all day long, those are 2 spaces that we can't put 3 classrooms of kids because we've had to quarantine teachers and some of the kids were not affected. And we last week or the week before, I believe, at the high school alone, we had 15 classrooms that are actually taking place in the media center because of quarantine teachers. We were able to maintain instruction with teachers teaching from home to the students who remained in the school. So that model has really actually worked very well for us and has prevented us from having to get into shutting down, as we have seen some other schools have to do because they can't manage the staff that are out in terms of the schedule. So, when we're using all of our spaces, if we had to use all of our spaces, it does give us, it provides us with less flexible space. And I'm talking about full in-person return and feeding lunch at the same time. But Mr. Lee, can you talk a little bit about the point number 3 on the pros?
Just talk to myself in silence over here. Number 3, it really relates to something Mr. Devens brought up several times, and that is our staff has been running 3 to 4 different programs on a daily basis for an elongated period of time. So a typical teacher is planning for kids that are in front of them in the hybrid model, home as part of the opposite cohort, or sharing materials with the fully remote teacher who is designing lessons for kids who are never going to step into the classroom. By combining the cohorts and meeting on a daily basis, the planning for those classes becomes much more linear, or can become much more linear for the classroom teacher who's putting that together. And that is a little easier of a lift for that classroom teacher who's designing units and designing lessons than the multiple types of lessons that currently having to design on a daily basis now. So there are advantages to our everybody in one spot walking through the curriculum at the same time. And a lot of that relates on what we're asking our teachers to do and how much more efficiently they can do it in a model that, again, is more linear.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Lee. So any other questions or comments from the subcommittee? Oh, Dr. Hackett, did you have one more slide?
No, we've actually covered all this already. So these are just the logistical challenges that we've already discussed earlier.
Okay. So any other questions or comments from the committee?
Through the chair.
Ms. Saros?
Just wanted to make sure, I know we're getting close to our next meeting. So our focus is on moving forward, more longer day, no lunch as of right now? Or are you?
I believe that's what we're going to bring to the full committee to make
Okay.
sure that
I just wanted to make
we
sure.
have alignment. Yeah, yeah. Okay, any other questions?
No, sir.
Okay. Dr. Hackett, next on the agenda is, I believe we have public comment, right? Are you muted?
Dr. Hackett, you
Sorry when I'm going between screens here.
You were doing great. I don't know what you said, but it was great.
I made sense to myself.
I
They just called me.
thought you were frozen again.
Did you notice I was? I was very.
Well, I had to
quick.
take my camera off because every time you spoke, it was unstable. So
Don't jinx them. Don't jinx them.
I know. All right. It looks like we're up to public comment. So do we have any hands up? I know we're getting close to the next meeting. Okay. I think I see Miss Carey's hand up.
We do, if I can, for some reason.
Miss Carey, how are you?
You know, I can't resist.
That's okay.
I figured it's better to ask my question here than to wait for the school committee. So back to the quarantine policy. I know we discussed that if we went to 3 feet, we would have to change the policy or at least look into the policy, because now we're affecting way more teachers if there is a student that tests positive, because you're going to have more kids in every single day. So the teachers would end up quarantining. And right now we have a huge issue at the high school, and we have a huge issue with kids that have switched to remote at the high school because they want to be able to play sports. They don't want to quarantine their entire senior year. They want to be able to work. And right now, someone who sits 20 feet away from them tests positive, they're quarantining. So I don't understand why we will not follow the guidelines by every major organization and just quarantine anyone who's within 6 feet for 10 to 15 minutes instead of entire classrooms.
We
It's gonna
appreciate
get worse.
the comment. I don't think there's anyone here that can address that. I think that really goes back to our health department and
Well,
possibly the mayor.
So the health department has not returned any of my emails on this. I've asked numerous times. I just don't understand it because we have so many kids who have now switched. So when you talk about numbers, there are so many high school kids who want to be in school, but they're not because of the quarantine policy. It has nothing to do with them being afraid. It has nothing to do with them learning better at home, because they're not. They learn better in person in school, but they're being forced to be remote, which is not helping anyone, because mainly they don't want their senior year to be horrible and not be able to play the sport that they love. They want to be able to work because they have to help support their families, and they want to learn, but they can't learn in a classroom when they keep getting quarantined and their teacher's quarantined the whole time. It needs to be addressed. It really does, especially at that high school level where there's more COVID cases and kids are quarantined all the time. I've had one child who's had one teacher quarantined twice. So for an entire month, she did not have that teacher in person, and she sat in the library for that class. It's not helping anyone.
No, we appreciate the comments and, you know, obviously we understand your concern, but it is not a Braintree Public School Department policy.
Well, the policy is set by the Board of Health, but it's not mandated by the state. So the superintendent and the school committee can override the policy.
Mr. Devon, we would have to, yeah, we would have to have a discussion about that as a committee. I don't know the answer.
I would just add, if I might, Mr. Corse, that it's, you know, the conversation in the health department, you know, with the school department and our director of nursing has been ongoing. I mean, we've had several conversations about the policy and the impact of the policy, and you know, how do we try to move on that in a different way. To your point, you know, there are other guidelines out there that would not require the quarantining of the entire classroom, and you know, certainly you're right that the high school it's more of an effect at the high school, likely because teachers are probably not necessarily as often getting in within 6 feet of the student, but also that students travel, so they're affecting it's affecting more than one classroom. So, you know, all I can say is we're continuing to have the discussion. You know, we have a lot of respect and have worked hard with the health department. I think that you know, as we've looked around and seen other schools totally shut down, you know, I don't know what their quarantine policies have been, but I do know that there have been multiple high schools, in fact, that have closed for 1 or 2 weeks at a time. We've not experienced that yet, but I certainly understand the points you're making around, you know, the impact on students in terms of, you know, coming to school and then leaving, having to leave. So we'll continue the discussion, but we're not going to solve it tonight.
No, but Milton, I know, did shut down, and I have a friend who's a vice principal there, and they shut down because they didn't have enough teachers.
Well,
she said it had nothing to do with COVID numbers. It had to do with didn't have enough teachers because they were doing the same thing we are, quarantining entire classrooms.
Right, and there have been more.
Making that point.
Yeah, I mean, there've been more schools that have shut down, but again,
no, but it wasn't because of COVID numbers, and the teachers weren't affected. It was like that there was one student, they were quarantining entire classrooms, so they had to shut down because they didn't have enough teachers. But
no,
based on based on the COVID numbers that we've had at the high school, how many teachers actually were tested positive because a student in their classroom was positive?
We're saying the same thing. It's Carrie. I understand the point. I understand the dilemma, and we continue to have conversations with the town.
But this is going to be a big issue when you try to have when these kids, there's going to be a huge influx of kids at some point at the high school that are going to want to be back in person. And we're not going to be able to control those numbers. I mean, you're going to tell every one of these kids, sorry, you're going to have to finish your year remote, and that you chose remote because you wanted to actually have a year. I mean, we're supposed to be looking out for the best interests of these kids and their safety. And I get that. But right now we're forcing these kids to learn at home because we're not giving them any options in school. Their teachers aren't there because they're quarantining. If they feel like it's not worth it to be in school, because if they are in school and if they're in the library and someone else tests positive in the library, oh crap, now they're going to be home. I mean, the policy doesn't work.
We totally understand, Ms. Carey, and actually tonight we're going to talk about health and safety in a couple of weeks. It's really not on the agenda for this subcommittee. I encourage you to, if you want to bring it up to the full committee, I think that's great, but we hear your comments and hopefully we can continue the discussion. So Dr. Hackett, are we now going into executive session?
We are with a vote.
All right.
So moved.
Second.
Okay. Ms. Saros,
Aye.
Mr. Devon,
Aye.
And the chair votes aye. We are now going into executive session. And I will take a motion to adjourn. We will not be coming out of executive session. We'll be adjourning and going to the regular school committee meeting at 6:30. So can I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
I'll
Okay, I
second
got
that.
a motion and a second. Ms. Saros,
Aye.
Mr. Devon,
Aye.
chair votes aye, unanimous. Thank you, everyone. We'll now be going into executive session.
Thank you.
Will that be given, will you be emailing us the
Yes.
new, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.